get rolling. Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod, live, joined by the great Dom of Bracketometry.com. Dom is one of the country's foremost bracketologists and has a track record of being one of the best, unlike certain personalities at ESPN and CBS, who, frankly, kind of stink. So Dom, welcome back to the show.
Appreciate you. Thank you for having me on. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're top, what, you're number three, you're top five, and you've been that way for a couple
Number
years
three
now.
right now. Yeah, been
Yeah,
number one at one point, trying to get it back, but no, happy to be in the top five.
yeah. So so if you're listening live, please feel free to type questions in the chat box. We want to make sure if you want to get things with Dom, we're going to obviously talk Michigan State, Big Ten, and some other things. But if you've got some other specific questions, certainly drop them in. Also, be sure to subscribe to the show. Hit the channel on the notification bell so you can know when we're going live on the air with various shows. Like I said, we do these post games now, and it's been a lot of fun. And appreciate reading your comments. Usually it's nice and snarky. They've all been happy after wins, and so it's been for Michigan State. It's been a lot easier year to have these shows. So anyway, again, thanks so much, Tom. I'll get us started just with the first question, and it's more just about broadly. There are two, I guess, two questions. One is, we feel like you kind of know how the brackets are put together as far as seating. And you get the instructions, but it does change from year to year. And so in some ways, you have to kind of guess what the tweaks are each year, right? I mean, because you'll look at what happened last year, like, okay, so they were weighting this more than this than in the past, like, the net or whatever it might be. How is it going to be different this year, do you think, than the previous years? I mean, do you have any sort of idea, sort of what the committee is thinking?
Yeah, and what's helping this year too is we have a few more data points on the team sheets that I think is going to make it a lot more fair when seeding teams. Like last year, there were just what was it? We only had two predictive metrics on the team sheets. So BPI, which is ESPN's tool that a lot of people have issues with, me myself.
Rightly so.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of issues with BPI, especially since it's still having a lot of preseason bias in what's supposed to be a metric, and instead it's just
Right.
taking into consideration what teams were expected to be at the start of the year. But yeah, this year they added T rank in there as well, which is another good metric. So now there's three predictive metrics and three result-based metrics on the team sheets. So it's going to make it a lot easier for the committee to kind of overlook maybe an outlier metric, like if the BPI is really hounding on a team because, well, they weren't supposed to be good and they're still being held back from those preseason biases. Now they'll be able to look at those other two predictive metrics and see, like, well, clearly that's a bit of an outlier, so we can kind of seed them more accordingly to the other two. Or if there's some other metric, whether it's one of the results based or the predictive, that are just a complete outlier to the others, now with three of each, I think it's going to be a lot easier for the committee to say, that's the one that's wrong. And clearly it is based on the rest of the resume. So I think this year teams might actually end up being seeded a little bit better than last year. Last year, I mean, I'm not just being biased because it knocked me off of being number one, but last year I think there's quite a few more things that I think they got wrong than in the past. But and just this year after the top four reveal, I felt like they were pretty spot on and did a good job with that. So I think with those extra metrics on the team sheets, we're looking like they're going to do a better job this year, and teams are going to be seated more fairly.
Can
Okay.
you just for our listeners' edification, uh, just define the difference between predictive metrics and results-based or resume metrics, I think is the other term that gets used. And maybe also highlight which ones are on those team sheets
Yeah,
so people
absolutely.
know.
So there's three that are of each. Well, first I'll talk about what each of them are.
Right.
So really the resume metrics or the results based metrics are a lot more just based off of how good your wins are, how bad your losses are. They're not very heavily weighted in how well you performed in those games. So I mean, there could be a team that snuck out like a bunch of close 1, 2 point wins against some good teams, and then I got absolutely killed in some others, but just purely based on the wins and the losses, that's how good your resume is, and that's what those result-based metrics or those resume metrics are telling you. And then the predictive metrics, they're a lot more weighted in things like game control, margin of victory, and they're more just trying to predict not how good your wins and losses are, but those are the metrics that are just kind of trying to determine how good a team is. Like those are the metrics Vegas is probably looking at closer to determine who
Points.
they should make a favorite or who they should make an underdog in a game. And again, you can argue, well, why that shouldn't really impact a team's resume just because the metrics say they're not good, but they've overachieved. They've earned that higher seed, and I've kind of always thought that, but that's not how the committee sees it at times. So yeah, those predictive metrics are more how good you actually are, and then the result-based metrics are how good your wins and losses are, regardless of if you overachieved or underachieved to get those.
So which ones? We know Ken Palm is one we use frequently on our podcast. That's a predictive metric.
Yes.
What
Ken
are some of
Palm.
what are the other ones that are being used by the committee this year? And then what are the resume metrics?
Yeah, so Ken Palm is one of the predictive metrics. I think probably the best predictive metric of the
I
three.
agree.
T rank is the one they're looking at now this year as well, on top of BPI, which is the third predictive metric, which is still unfortunately on there. Not nothing against ESPN, just against their metric,
Oh,
which I'm not a
no,
fan
totally fine to be
of.
against ESPN.
Fair enough. Yeah, and then the results-based metrics, those are WAB, which comes from Bart Torvik, strength of record, and KPI.
And so, uh, and this is something that I think gets a lot of people confused. The use of net, which replaced RPI that had been around forever. And as I understand it, net is a bit of a black box. They won't tell you what really is being used to generate those rankings, right? It's sort of,
Yeah.
in some ways, it's a mystery. I mean, I'm sure some of it has been sorted out by people that are trying to reverse engineer it, but it is a bit of a black box. Tell me if I'm right about this. My impression has been that net's primary value is really in sorting teams by quads. People will hear the references to a quad one win. Sometimes now you're even hearing quad 1A wins. So they're even subdividing quad one, but it's separating teams into those quadrants. And then that becomes a factor more in the cut line than the seed lines, right?
No, you're spot on. That's where a lot of people get confused and they think net is a metric, just like Ken Palm is, or just like strength of record is. Net isn't used as a metric to where they're saying like, oh, this team's net is better than this team's net, so that gives them an edge. It really does not matter at all unless in extreme circumstances what a team's individual net is. Like you said, it's a sorting tool. The net really matters a lot more for determining how good your wins and losses are and how bad your wins and losses are. And like you said, sorting them into the quad. So the net of who you play matters, but your own net does not matter nearly as much as your own metrics do or what your quad records are against those teams you played.
One more quick question on this stuff, and I appreciate you clarifying it for our
Yeah.
listeners. Um, do you sense between the predictive metrics and the resume metrics that there tends to be one or the other having more of an impact on seeding, or is it not really a detectable bias one way or the other, or is it just random from year to year depending upon who's on the committee?
It changes year to year based on the committee for sure, but I would say usually the predictive metrics play more of an impact in terms of like seeding once you've been selected.
Right.
So like for those teams that are safely in and are fighting for like the top 6 or 7 seeds but are nowhere near the bubble, I think the predictive metrics are playing a lot more of a role than the results-based metrics. But the result-based metrics, I think, actually play are even more heavily weighted than the predictives once you get closer to the bubble. because I think the committee is trying to do it, and I think this is fair, to where they're not just putting a team in the field because the predictive metrics say they're good. They're trying to put the teams in that have actually earned it, and that's what the result-based metrics show. Like, all right, this team has actually done it. They've gotten the wins, they've avoided the losses, they've earned their spot in the field. So yeah, I think if you're on the bubble, those result-based metrics are a lot more important. But if you're pretty safely in and you have some bad predictive metrics, then that might kind of knock your seed down, even though you're still safely in the field.
Gotcha. Erica, anything else on that? Or are we ready to go into
Well,
our?
I had one other quick question
Yeah.
about sort of the mechanics of it, and just when it comes to the seeding, I think it's pretty obvious that you can see the teams 1 through 8, and then one plays 8, so your best one plays your worst 2 is sort of how they try and do it. But how does it go from there? Like, does the worst 2 play the best 3? Is that kind of how, and is that how they sort of determine that, or is it just now at this point just kind of like regional, just kind of random?
A lot more regional at that point. Really, they once you're put into this, they're not going to change your seed to put you in a better location, unless they pretty much have to. But yeah, at that point, unless it's completely unweighted, they're gonna do it completely just based on region. And then there's usually like, I at least in the top 4 seeds, it kind of changes year by year, but they would like add up the numbers. So like for example, you're not gonna get the best 1, the best 2, the best 3,
Hmm.
and the best 4 all in the same bracket just because they all kind of are in the same region. But if it's not completely unweighted, you could get like the best 1, the second best 2, the second best 3, and the third best 4 in one side, and then like the second, third, and fourth
Sure.
best
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
another. So they'll make it unbalanced to an extent to get teams closest to their areas, as long as it doesn't make it completely unbalanced. And it's kind of just like a fine line of weighing that, and that does change year to year.
Okay.
All
Yeah,
right.
and
Well,
I think,
let's.
yeah,
Yeah.
go
Go
ahead,
ahead.
Rod, because I was going to say it pretty much, I think Jason Krulik is on. He has pretty much your first question, so just go ahead and fire away.
Sure. So, thanks for that overview of the process. I think now we'll want to talk about some specific teams, and we'll start with the most important one. Um,
Who could
Can you
that be?
guess? Can you guess?
what
Michigan. No
upside?
kidding.
Oh,
Yeah.
all right. It was nice talking to you, Dom. We'll see.
So, it seems to me fairly clear that the consensus right now is Michigan State is firmly on the 2 line. And they're not the last 2 seed according to the consensus. I looked at Bracket Matrix earlier today. I think their average seed is a 1.9 something actually. So given that, what upside do you think is actually left for Michigan State in terms of a seed? And so by that, I think what I'm saying is, do you think there's any chance that they can get to the 1 line if they were to run the table until 2 Sundays from now? So they win their last 2 regular season games this coming week against Iowa and Michigan, and then they go into the Big Ten tournament and get to the final. And we know that the result of the championship game doesn't tend to mean anything. If they did that, if they won those 4 games, and we can presume that probably all 4, I guess, because a road game at Iowa might be a quad 1.
It is.
They're probably all that would give Michigan State, I think, 14 quad 1 wins. Pretty impressive. Um, if they did all of that, is there any shot in your view that they can get to the 1 line? Because I'm not seeing it the way that things seem to be shaking out.
Yeah, I have them right now on my seed list at 7. Now the pros and cons for them getting up to the a 1 seed is first off, I do think there's a bit of a gap. The top 6 have kind of been the clear top 6 for a while, and they still have a little bit of an edge on Michigan State at the moment. But what could be the upside there is of that current top 6, 4 of those are SEC teams.
Mhm.
Auburn is going to be a 1 seed no matter what. They could lose every remaining game. I still think they might be number 1 overall. So
We're going to come back to
if,
that.
if you want Michigan State to get a 1 seed, I think you're Auburn fans. Because if anyone else wins the SEC tournament of
Yeah.
Bama, Tennessee, Florida, they're almost certainly joining Auburn on the 1 seed line. But if Auburn just keeps rolling through everyone and Bama, Tennessee, Florida, each suffer another loss, and none of them win the SEC tournament, which means they all end up with 2 more losses down the stretch. Maybe there's a chance Auburn's that only SEC team on the 1 line, and Michigan State's able to kind of slide past all of those because right now I'd have Bama, Tennessee, and Florida 4, 5, and 6, and Michigan State would have to pass all of them to get there. So that's why I think it would be tough because I think
Yeah.
most likely the SEC is going to get a second one there. But again, if Bama, Tennessee, Florida kind of beat each other up and Auburn just runs through the SEC, maybe they only get one and Michigan State wins out and sneaks past all of them. Still think it'd be close, but definitely root for Auburn to win the SEC tournament. And then also, I think Duke, unless they completely collapse, is probably going to get one of them, even if they don't win the ACC tournament. Now, maybe Houston.
That
Maybe
was the one I wondered about.
yeah. Houston is maybe passable. Kind of back to what I was talking about earlier, though. The predictive metrics absolutely love them. I mean, they have them on average as like number 2, right behind Auburn. So
Hmm.
they they probably need to lose a couple more games and maybe lose a game by a significant margin at some point to kind of bring some of those metrics down. But if that were to happen, sure they could fall off the 1 line as well. I would say that Michigan State, if they went out, I'd still say more than likely it is a 2. But there's possibilities with Houston losing a couple of games. Like I said, you probably need them to win another regular season game and in the tournament, or the SEC just beating each other up and Auburn running through it, and Michigan State getting ahead of one of those. Neither are likely, but the fact that both are possible, say if Michigan State wins out, maybe they have a 1 in 3 chance of getting a 1 seed.
Okay, that's a
Okay.
little higher than I would have thought, actually. So that's
Maybe I'm
encouraging.
being generous, maybe 1 in 4, but somewhere around there.
I
Yeah.
was thinking more like 1 in 10, but that may be my pessimism around the idea that Houston is going to implode to the level they probably need to.
Yeah.
Big 12 just is, in my mind, it's not quite as good in terms of depth as it's been in years past. So I kind of have a hard time seeing them losing a couple. But and I guess the other question relative to all of this is from a Michigan State perspective, if they take care of their own, cut their own grass, so to speak, and win these next 4 games, presumably that would put them in a decent position to perhaps be the top 2 seed. Like it seems to me that's gettable to get to
Yeah, absolutely.
the 5th spot, right? And at that point, what does it really matter? Being the 5 or the 4? You're still dealing with the same team, most likely, right?
Exactly. And I think then sometimes it's better to be the top 2, because then you might end up getting a bit more preference in terms of what regions you're playing in early. So if you're the last 1 seed, you're kind of just getting shoved into wherever fits after the top 3 1 seeds. You're that
True.
top 2 seed, you're going to get a lot more preference in terms of where you're going to play. Um, and yeah, and then you're probably getting matched up with. You're not going to play Auburn either if you're that top 1 seed, and I think that's your top 2 seed, and that's who you want to avoid. So yeah, there could be an argument the top 2 seed being better than the bottom 1.
Yeah. And then the corollary to that, of course, is Michigan State dropping to a 3. I mean, how does that happen? Do you have to tank the last 2 games? If they win the next 2 games, win the Big Ten, are they pretty much a 2 no matter what happens in the Big Ten tournament?
I would presume so. I'm looking at some of the teams I have behind them. I guess also it's funny. It's a two-headed sword. We were saying Houston losing in the Big 12 tournament could help them get to a 1, but I think Houston winning the Big 12 tournament would almost really help securing them at a 2 seed as well, because there are a lot of those Big 12 teams right behind, like Iowa State,
Yeah,
Right, right.
Texas Tech. If one of
that's
those
true.
teams won the Big 12 over Houston, they're probably a 2 seed, as well as those other two SEC teams. And then you could have the fear of, okay, well, if Iowa State wins the Big 12 and St. John's runs out, wins the table and runs out and wins the Big East, they could be a 2 as well and maybe push them down to a 3. So, yeah, maybe just actually go Houston. Don't worry about the outside chance of getting to a 1. Make sure none of those Big 12 teams like Iowa State or Texas Tech make a push for a 2 by beating Houston. And then, yeah, I think you guys are probably locked at a 2 unless an Iowa State, a Texas Tech, one of those wins the Big 12, which could maybe push them and St. John's into those last 2 spots.
All right. Well, longtime listeners of the show, you've been on a couple times. They know you're a Bobcat, right? Texas State,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, right. And Nudge Printing, one of our sponsors of the show, our original sponsor, is a huge supplier of Texas State apparel. I don't know if you're aware of that.
I did
So
not, but
you can get all kinds of stuff there. Now, obviously, our listeners are generally Michigan State apparel, and so they're going to go for that stuff. Also, the other schools in Michigan, but Nudge Printing is super high quality stuff, and you'll love it. They've got all kinds of things. Texas State is actually amazing. Their selection is pretty impressive, so you have to check it out. And as a listener to the show, you get 20% off. You type in Final Four as one word into the checkout. And so head on over to Nudge Printing at nudgeprinting.com for that stuff. All right.
yeah, I'll check
So
them out after the show.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have 20% off. You can't lose, right? I mean,
Exactly.
can't have enough hoodies. All right. So the next question we had was about, so we're going to talk now just more broadly of Big Ten. And it's always the interesting talk is, of course, the bubble. We got 3 teams in the bubble in the Big Ten. We got Indiana, Nebraska, Ohio State are sort of the 3 I think most people talk about on the bubble.
Very bubbly. All
Very
of them.
bubbly. Anyone we're missing that can fall in the bubble or that's, can come enter the bubble beyond them? I mean, does Rutgers have a chance of getting in? I mean, that'd be the one outside chance that
Yeah,
which I can't
I think
envision.
pretty much you hit the nail on the head with those 3. I think everyone ahead of them is at this point of the season pretty much a lock. And the anyone behind those 3 is pretty much completely eliminated. So
Hmm.
it's weird this year. Sometimes at this point in the season, there's like a team that, ooh, I think they're like an 80% chance, or ooh, they have a 20% chance. This year, there's what, one, two, three, four, five, six, there's 8 locks. There's one, two, three, four, five, six, 7 teams, 0% chance. And then you got 3 teams that are 50-50.
Yeah. So I guess those 3 teams. I mean, is it how does it shake out for those teams? It just depend who win. Like if they all go 2-0, which they can't all because I think some of them are playing each other.
There's
But
some head-to-head games.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's some head-to-head games I think with Indiana. But are they so you're just saying that basically if they win 2 games and win a Big Ten tournament game, they're probably those teams are in most
I mean,
likely.
right now, I think they're all probably more likely in than out, but I feel like all 3 aren't going to make it when it's all said and done.
Sure,
But
that's
given
usually how it
that right
works.
now, I have all 3 in, and this is I mean, it sounds cliche because it's said every year, but this year specifically, this is a weak bubble. This is a very
Yeah.
weak bubble. So
Yeah,
could all 3 of these teams get in? Absolutely. But you look and they all kind of play each other down the stretch. Ohio State, that's actually their last 2 games. They get
right.
Nebraska and Indiana. So, like looking at Ohio State specifically, they probably just need a split there, and then win a Big Ten tournament game. If they lose both, they're probably done. If they win both, they're probably in. And then, yeah, if they split, could just come down to how they do in the tournament. Nebraska's the weird one where, man, had
Yes.
they just not lost to Minnesota this weekend,
Yeah.
I think they would have been in a great spot. And now there's a lot more pressure on them. I mean, same thing. Any of these 3 teams, they go 2-0 down the stretch. I think they got it. I mean, Nebraska gets at Ohio State and then Iowa. Indiana gets at Oregon. I mean, they win in Oregon, they could lose to Ohio State and still get in. That would be a huge win. Um, but yeah, Indiana's made the one that could maybe go 1-1, and I'd almost say they're locked just because that game is at Oregon. That wouldn't really hurt them that much at all if they lost that. Then as long as
Hmm.
they beat Ohio State at home, they're probably in. So yeah, really, all 3 of these teams they're all locks at 2-0, and I still think that each one would have a better than 50% chance just going 1-1 in their last two games. But then it could come down to, are there bid thieves? Do they lose in the tournament early? So yeah, recommend they all go 2-0 in these last games, but even 1-1, if I'm a fan of one of those teams, still liking where we're at.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, looking at Ohio State and Nebraska specifically, neither one of them has any case to be upset because
Yeah.
both of them have been pretty miserable down the stretch. You mentioned Nebraska losing to Minnesota. They also, just prior to that, lost maybe the worst college basketball game I've ever seen in my life when Michigan went in there a week ago tonight and won. Saying they won ugly doesn't even begin to describe it.
Yeah.
Um,
They should have paid all the fans on the way out for
it
that
was
to witness
outrageous
that.
how bad that game was.
Winning
But yeah, neither
49
one of
is
them.
something.
Whereas IU, I think, remarkably, because they just seemed DOA for so long, um, IU, I think, it has been impressive in lately in terms of what they've done. So it feels, and I know they say, the old saw about, oh, your last five games. We know that doesn't mean anything anymore, if it ever did. But it's still interesting to me that they seem to have figured out a way to be playing at or near their best when it's counted. And so to me, they feel like the best of the three at this moment. But as we know, that really doesn't count for much if they don't get it done over the next week.
Yeah, and what I like a lot about Indiana is the fact that they don't have any bad losses. I
That's
mean,
true.
they have 11 losses, but all 11 losses are quad one games, and they have four quad one. I mean, they're 4-11 in quad one, which doesn't sound great, but that means you have four good wins, and none of those 11 losses are bad losses. And then in all
Right.
the other quads, they're completely undefeated. So no bad losses and four good wins is not a bad resume when there's a really weak bubble this year. So yeah, that's why I
And
think as long as they just beat Ohio State at home in that last game, that would be a Q2 game. So they probably do want to win that one, but win that, you're looking all right.
so we talked about the bottom of the Big Ten in terms of not the bottom, but the bottom in terms of teams with tournament potential. And we've talked about the very top at Michigan State. So I wanted to discuss that. It's unfair to call them middle class, but those teams in between those two poles. So I'd like to start with Wisconsin because before yesterday's game, my sense is that Wisconsin was hovering right there in that nebulous 2 to 3 range. They come to East Lansing, they lose by 9. That's certainly not anybody's idea of a bad loss to lose at Breslin against this Michigan State team. Do you see it as a possibility that Wisconsin could get back to the 2 line? Was that loss really not very damaging?
It wasn't very damaging, but where it was damaging is that it put Michigan State pretty squarely on the two line. I think that game was pretty much a battle of winner is on the two line, loser is on the three line. So even though it wasn't a super damaging loss to themselves, it's just kind of boxing them out because now
Gotcha.
Michigan State is holding them back from getting there to where had they won that, not only would they have been on the two line, but they would have probably been ahead of Michigan State at that point. So it not a super damaging loss, but also they don't have the wins now the rest of the way to really help them get back there. I mean, they play at Minnesota, home Penn State. Neither of those are really
Right.
needle movers. Now, maybe if they and here's the, like we always said, the Big Ten tournament game championship usually doesn't play a big role. Theoretically, in my head, I want to say, well, if they went out and beat Michigan State in the championship game, maybe they swap back in with them and go to a two again. But usually that game doesn't make a big difference. So it's hard to see them get back to a two. I could have said they had a great chance to do it before the game against Michigan State, but that game really was their chance.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. And then looking at the teams just behind them, uh, we'll start with our local friends from down the road, Michigan, who have been in the parlance we've been using in our parts is that team's been leaking oil for about a month and somehow had been winning,
Yeah.
you know, but that didn't happen yesterday. Also didn't happen when Michigan State visited, but it was a real disaster yesterday. Uh, where do you kind of see the Wolverines at this point? They've got a tough week too. They host Maryland and then they travel to East Lansing to wrap up the regular season. So it's very easy to see two more regular season losses coming. How do you see the Wolverines stacking up?
Yeah, absolutely. Right now, I kind of have them right about as a 4 seed. Going to come up with a new update tomorrow, and I think that would be a pretty fair place to have them at the moment. But you're right; they do seem like a team that's just kind of been squeaking out games they shouldn't have won and playing with fire and getting away with it. And then it kind of just all came crashing down against Illinois. So yeah, if they were to lose their next two, they could continue to slip and probably to at least a 5, maybe even a 6 if some of those teams behind them keep winning and keep inflating their resumes while Michigan is not. But if they were to win those two, those are two really good wins themselves, and they're probably back up to probably a high 3, maybe also knocking on the door of the 2, but unlikely. So yeah, right now their range is probably somewhere from like a 3 to a 5. But if they were to lose both these next two and then lose early in the Big Ten tournament, could they even drop as low as a 6? Yeah, probably. So, but right
Mhm.
now about a 4 with room to move up or down.
Okay. And then the last two I wanted to ask you about Purdue. 4 game losing streak, went from seemingly in pole position in the Big Ten, and I think they were generally considered likely as a 2 seed at that point, to losing 4 straight. They finally managed to reverse that by winning a game this weekend over UCLA. Where do you see the Boilers kind of fitting in terms of what their upside and downside might be?
I think they're probably about in like right now, resume wise, pretty much equal with Michigan, where I'd have both of them right around the middle of the 4 line right now. Now again, they have Rutgers in their next game and then at Illinois.
Yeah.
So maybe they could, if they were to lose to Rutgers, that could be a pretty damaging one. They could be down to a 5 or a 6 just like that. But as long as they beat Rutgers, even if they lost to Illinois, they're probably somewhere still around that 4 seed that I currently have them at. And if they were to win the next two, maybe they could even push back up to a 3. Get crushed Illinois and lose early in the Big Ten tournament, slip down to a 5. But I don't see them swaying too far away from that 4 I currently have them at. That I just feel like they're going to end up at a 4 at the end, and if they don't, it's going to be somewhere close.
And then the last team, which is also sitting in kind of a similar spot in terms of record and in terms of their rankings, from what I've seen, is Maryland.
Yes, yeah, Maryland. Maryland right now, I would probably have. I'm just looking at. I was starting to put together my my sheet for tomorrow. I'm gonna have them probably like at a high 6 tomorrow. I think that's a reasonable spot for them. And then that game at Michigan is probably that's a big one for them. Again, because like right now I got Michigan at a 4, Maryland at about a 6. But if they were to win that, then they're probably both probably gets them up to a 5, maybe Michigan down to a 5, and then they have a chance to keep winning in the Big Ten tournament and moving up. I don't think their resume, even though the record's there, is quite on par with those other ones. Now, I think as far as how good of a team they are pretty good. So I could see them continuing to move up. Those predictive metrics do like them. So if they keep
That's what I
winning,
was going to ask you about, because I understand that the resume, take Michigan out of it because we know they're maybe a half step ahead. But when you look at a team like Purdue, for example, I can understand where the resume might look a little better, because I think Purdue had at least one. Didn't Purdue beat Alabama? So they had an impressive non-conference win on their
yeah,
resume,
yeah, they beat Alabama at home. That
which
was their
Maryland
big out of
really didn't.
conference.
Maryland doesn't have an equivalent to that. So maybe that's a separator. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the predictive metrics really do like Maryland. And for the nothing that it matters, I think the eye test does too. I think they're the second best team in the Big Ten. I really do. Depth is a question, but that's a very good team, and their starting five is crazy good. But you do seem to have them that kind of half notch lower than the competition, at least
And
at the
that is
competition of the
because of
league.
that I mean, it's not just that they're non-conference, they didn't get a good win in it. Their non-conference was the terror. Their non-conference strength of schedule was, I think, somewhere in the 300s.
Okay, all
And
right.
that's one of those things where your predictive metrics could be very good like they are, but the committee does like to punish really bad non-conference strength of schedules. Like, I mean, if your non-conference strength of schedule isn't amazing, but you got a couple good wins here or there in it, that's not going to be something they're just going to arbitrarily punish you for. But yeah, when you have a non-conference can't talk strength of schedule that's sub 300, that's
Yeah.
almost just an arbitrary seed line bump down right out of the gate already. So, yeah, they're kind of a tough one because they have those gaudy predictive metrics the committee likes, but they also have that horrific non-conference schedule where the committee might go, that's how those predictive metrics are so good. They were just destroying people out of conference that were really bad, and that's when maybe they put a little less weight into it like they do at other times.
But that's really helpful. I did not realize that their non-conference straight the schedule was that bad. That explains it perfectly. One more quick one, and then I'll turn it back to Eric since we're going to be leaving Big Ten discussion at this point. I'm just curious. This isn't asking for opinions on making the field, but I'm curious your opinion. The Big Ten has moved to a format this year for its tournament where the bottom three teams are done. They don't even qualify for the Big Ten tournament. And I think it's actually added some excitement to games that in years past, there probably wouldn't have been a lot of juice. As we're talking about this, I'm watching, I've got UCLA and Northwestern on. Northwestern would be in the field if it started today, but they're only one game up on teams that
Right.
aren't. So they need to win. And there are several games, most all but say a couple games, the rest of the way seem to have some meaning. I'm just curious, as someone who's not necessarily a Big Ten person, what your view is of that. Then we've on the other side, we've had Penn State's coach who have been eliminated, just very, very upset about this move for obvious reasons. It's personal interest coming in, but I'm curious what your take is on that.
Oh, I absolutely love it. I mean, the regular season should mean something, and these late games should mean something to these teams. I mean, like if you're a team like Penn State in previous years or Northwestern right now, in previous years, well, all right, we're not making the field as an at-large. It just all comes down to winning the tournament. So why even try in these last few games?
Right.
Let's just kind of coast, stay healthy, maybe not even play some of our banged up starters a lot down the stretch. That way, we're just ready to maybe try to make a miracle tournament run. And I don't like that. It almost kind of feels like teams are just like tanking at that point, like they do in professional sports. Now, these teams towards the bottom, they still have to play down the stretch. And they're not just rolling over for these top teams, giving them huge wins and inflating their records that in kind of disproportionate ways. Now these teams really are having to try and care in every single game down the stretch, even if they're eliminated from at-large contention. And then also from a bracketology standpoint, I think it's smart in the Big Ten to do this not just to make games matter down the stretch, but also by knocking a few of those really bad teams out.
It's a good
Now
point.
Yeah.
you're eliminating the possibility that one of those really bad teams beats one of your bubble teams and knocks them out of the field. You're eliminating the possibility of bad losses for your bubble teams, which is probably going to make it more likely you get more teams in the field. So I think it makes for more entertaining basketball in the final weeks of the season. And I think it helps your league theoretically get more bids. I think it was a genius move by the Big Ten. I love it.
Yeah. I didn't thought about the bubble movements too. Well, we're talking about teams that we spend a lot of time. I'm sure you don't listen to the show very often, but we spend a lot of time talking about the Gutters because one of our sponsors, the Brothers of Just Gutters, they do fantastic work. If you the east or west side of the state, You want to get contact and take care of them because it rains a lot. There's a lot of, melting snow, those sorts of things. You got to make sure you have good gutter work. And we're going to talk about some gutter teams here. And these are the teams on the bubble. So just as a reminder, of course, you get 10% off if you want, if you get gutter work done by the Brothers Adjusted Gutters, but just by mentioning Final Four as a listener of the show. You can head over to our support page to find ways to contact them at tffinots.com/support. So let's talk about the gutter teams in the gutter. The teams are just kind of like ready to get washed away out of the tournament. Where is your bubble right now? Your last four in, next four, those sorts of things everyone keeps track of.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, so right now, I think a lot of those teams we were talking about are from the Big Ten. I think
Yeah,
Indiana is probably just ahead of my last four in right now, but just barely. But then the other two, Nebraska and Ohio State, probably are. It would be in my last four in right now. I think Nebraska maybe a little safer on the upper end of it. Ohio State a little closer to the cut line. And then the other teams that I would have in my last four in, that would probably be. I mean, boy, I was kind of torn right now between a couple of teams. I think right now my other last two teams in, with Nebraska and Ohio State, would be Arkansas and Boise, and then you probably got Xavier, Oklahoma, North Carolina, and Texas just outside of the field.
Interesting.
All right.
And
Now,
I'm still debating between a few of those. Like I could still put Oklahoma in ahead of one of Arkansas, Boise, Ohio State. Could put Xavier in ahead of one of those, but all those teams are just kind of a muddled mess right now.
can I ask a follow-up to that then? You mentioned, and it seems to be the consensus, as you say, people say it every year, the bubble is really soft, but it really seems to be soft this year. Are you finding that that's making your job tougher to get the 68 right? Because there's so many teams that just don't have a compelling case, but somebody's got to make it.
Absolutely, because a lot you like to when you're doing bracketology compare resumes to previous years, and it's like, okay, well, usually when a team has this and this and this, they're in, or when the team has this and this and this, they're out. And if you do that this year, you're not going to have 68 teams. So
Right.
I'm almost having to look back now at previous years and look at like the resumes of the teams that were the first four out as opposed to teams that
Wow.
didn't even make their first four out. Because this year, I think like the last four in, those resumes are going to be a lot more comparable to previous years' first four outs than actual last four ins. So it does make it definitely tougher because you can't really do those past year comparisons as well as you kind of could in previous years, seeing as just there's going to be some teams making it this year's that people like to pull up the stats. Well, a team has never made it with this before, and it's like, all right, well, if we do that with everyone, then we're not going to have a complete bracket. So there's going to be some changes to those credences this year.
It kind of also, I think, highlights the absolutely atrocious idea that's being floated about expanding this thing. I mean, talk about bad timing to try to make that push.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think there's been some years in the recent past where like maybe there were a handful of teams that just missed it that I think I would have had them in. So I mean, if they expanded it by four teams, would I go rally in the street? I would be okay with four more. This would not be the year I'm okay with four more, though, as you said. So yeah, this is the wrong year for them to start like going to the media and actually like talking about it being a possibility because four more this year would be absolutely atrocious. In some other years, maybe four more would have been okay, but that's the absolute max I would be okay with. Because then you could have all the 4 16s be a play-in and then just four at-large play-in games. And at that point, all right, fine. I mean, you're technically putting more teams in, but all those extra teams are having to play in play-ins anyway. So they're going to be eliminated before the real first round regardless. So if you want to throw them a bone, sure. And the reason I'd be okay with maybe four more is just sometimes the committee gets it wrong. That way, then the teams that originally would have been the first four out that I think should have gotten in will actually be in. But yeah, this year, I'm glad they haven't done it yet if they are going to do it, because I don't even think the last four in that are going to make it this year should be in. So no one can
Right.
complain that their team missed the field this year.
When we talk about features of the tournament that play into some of exactly what we were just discussing, who just gets in, who just gets left out, the term we always hear is bid steal.
Mhm.
And so I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, but the definition of that would be a team that didn't win its regular season in a mid-major, low-major conference, winning the conference tournament, but then the regular season champ in that league was good enough that they get in as an at-large, and it means that league is taking two bids rather than one, which means somebody else who would have been in otherwise is being left out. Who do you see? And I'm guessing there aren't a lot of them, if any. But who do you see in the mid-major ranks that you think is going to get in as an at-large, even if they don't win their conference tournament?
Well, see that you say that, but actually, I think that's not the case this year, and that might be the saving grace for this year's
Okay.
bubble. Because I actually, well, and it's halfly because this bubble is so bad that some of these mid
Yeah.
majors I think could still get it in an at large. So like the ones I would go through, I don't know if I mean, some might not even argue that they're a mid major conference, but the A10, for example, VCU. I think if they were to
Okay.
lose in the A10 tournament, probably still gets in. So if like a George Mason or a Dayton or a Loyola Chicago, I mean, all very good St. Joseph's, any of those make a run in the A10 and VCU loses, I think there's a good chance the A10 becomes a two bid league where they currently would not been. Drake in the Missouri Valley. I think they're probably in a pretty good space right now to get an at large. So, say Bradley or Northern Iowa wins the Missouri Valley. Missouri Valley could be a two bid league. And then even the Big West, and that's kind of the surprise one this year.
Yeah.
UC San Diego has quite the resume. They are a great team, but UC Irvine's no slouch either. I don't think UC Irvine has the ability to get an at large like UC San Diego does, but I could see UC Irvine win the Big West over UC San Diego, allowing both of those to get in. So that might actually be what saves the bubble this year. If VCU, Drake, and UC San Diego all lose their conference tournaments, but all still get in, then this really ugly bubble suddenly isn't so ugly anymore because there's three whole less spots.
Well, we had a question from one of our listeners. So Peter asking just an extension of that of the mid majors. You know, do you see any Cinderellas like making a run this year that you think have the potential to do some damage?
Absolutely. No, there are some very good mid-major teams this year. I mean, I always love picking the Ivy League teams in my bracket, and I think Yale has a very good team this year to watch out for. They're probably going to be in that 12, 13 seed range where there's always an upset every single year.
Hmm.
So I think that would be a good one. Who else? Akron out of the MAC. Akron has just been an absolute wagon as of late. 23-6 overall. They've only lost one game in the MAC all year. They're a fun team to watch, and they're just kind of a frustrating matchup for any of those top teams. And then some of those like really low ones as well, like whoever comes out of the Sun Belt. I don't even know who that's gonna be, but as a Texas State fan, I've watched some Sun Belt basketball this year, and I don't think we're gonna be the ones coming out. If we are, don't pick us. That'll be I don't know how we would do it. That would be amazing. But there's a log jam at the top of the Sun Belt this year. Four teams hung Sun Belt championship banners. It was a four-way tie at top.
Wow.
Oh
Yeah.
my gosh.
And it's, yeah, any of those four teams come out, watch out whoever that is too, just because they've been battle tested. It's a very evenly matched league at the top. They've been playing competitive basketball left and right. And then you look at some of those teams at the top, like Arkansas State, for example, if they come out, they won at Memphis earlier this year. So, I mean, these teams can compete. So, yeah, I won't give you a specific one because I have no idea who wins it, but whoever comes out of the Sun Belt, I think, is worth a good look as well.
Okay.
Well, there's a
Turning
yes.
to
Go ahead.
the other side of the equation, this is a year where I think we've seen some blue bloods really struggle some, and I've got three in particular that I wanted to ask you about. I'll start with what I think is the easiest one. I was actually seeing some talk maybe a week or so ago that Gonzaga might not actually be able to keep their streak intact of tournament appearances, which I think is just one game behind Michigan State's. I think they're at 25 heading into this season. Uh, but I also got the sense that they sort of solidified an at-large bid for themselves if they don't win the WCC tournament with what they did this week. Are you in that camp? You think they're solidly in now?
They're a lock now. That win at San Francisco pretty much it locked it in for them for sure. That was a Q1 win. So yeah, with another one of those on the resume now, they're looking pretty darn good. Yeah, they're not going to miss it. And now that they're going to be in, I think they're looking pretty. It could end up with a pretty good seed because they're another one where the predictive metrics
Yep.
are in love with them. I mean,
Yeah.
their predictive metrics are like as good as Michigan State's are.
I was going to say,
get it.
I think they're ahead of Michigan State in Ken Palm.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
they're one spot ahead. Last time I
absolutely.
checked. Yeah. So okay, so that's a good point. So you actually think not only are they safely in, but they're certainly not in competition for a 2, I wouldn't think, but you could see what, maybe a 4 for
I see
Gonzaga?
that maybe would still be a little high. Right now, I'm debating tomorrow between like having them. I could have them anywhere from a 6 to an 8, and
Wow. Okay.
they're they're just a very hard team to seed. Because the top seeds this year, as bad as the bubble is, are very, very good. Like it's such a massive gulf. Like
Mhm.
there's teams all the way down to the 8 seeds that whoever I have at an 8, when I post my bracket, I know there's going to be fans that are like, how are we an 8? This is absolutely atrocious. And there's like, I agree. Like the top 30, 31 teams. Yeah, there's going to be teams at an 8 that should probably be a 6 or higher based on their resume. And then, yeah, it quickly goes down real fast when you get down to like the 10s, 11s. How are you even in? There's just from like the 8 line to the 10 line, just a massive gulf where it just goes from teams seem underseeded to teams seem overseeded. So yeah, just given the fact that despite those predictives being good, there's just a lot of really good resumes ahead of them. I still think they're probably in that 6 to 8 range. But yeah, in other years where there's not so many good teams log jammed at the top, those predictive metrics could even elevate them higher. And if they went out and beat St. Mary's in the WCC championship, with their championship game being earlier than last, they still do have a way to move up, and I could see them get up to maybe as high as a 5 seed.
Okay. But still conceivable that Gonzaga could be sitting there in an 8-9 game. Like that could
Absolutely.
happen.
Yeah. If they don't win the
Wow.
WCC, that is not impossible. And yeah, I mean, it's funny. You're saying like a week or so ago, they could have been out of the field. And that's not crazy either. They're one of those teams where once they got comfortably into the field like they are now they're kind of up more in that like 6, 7, 8, maybe 5 conversation because of those predictives. But had they lost at San Francisco, then those predictives wouldn't have mattered as much if they were kind of more in that bubble conversation, and
All
they
right.
could have played themselves out as well. So
That's really interesting.
that was
All
a
right.
massive win for them this weekend.
So two more I wanted to discuss. Kansas, preseason number 1, have had, by their standards, a miserable season. They're obviously a lock for the field. We're not talking about that. But where do you see the down? Because I believe they've got a really tough week in front of them. I think they play Houston, and I
Yeah.
want to say they play somebody else that's a tournament team as well. And then they got the Big 12 tournament. Where's the floor for Kansas? Could they
Yeah,
be in an 8-9 game?
that right now, I still think they're probably sitting around a 6. But you're right. If they keep losing, they could keep sliding down the field. Now, they are bolstered by, they started the season very well. I mean, they beat Duke on a neutral
Right.
floor. They
Beat,
beat
beat Michigan
Michigan
State.
State on
Yep.
a neutral floor. Exactly. I'm sure you know that one all too
Yeah.
well. Just those two wins alone, having one of the best non-conference strength
That's
of
true.
schedule in the top 25 in the country, two huge quad 1A wins on a neutral field. I think those alone are kind of just keeping their heads above water and to not falling into that 8-9 range. Because I mean, if you're the committee, you're probably looking at that and it's like, man, can we give Kansas, who's capable of beating these top teams, to a 1 seed? So I'm thinking that that floor probably should be a 7. But if they lose both games this week to Houston and to Arizona, and then maybe lose their first Big 12 tournament game, if they go 0-3 down the stretch, yeah, given how competitive those top 8 seeds are, like I said, they could fall to an 8. They could fall to an 8, but I think as long as, even if they lose to Houston tonight, as long as they beat Arizona, which would be a good win to close out the regular season, then no matter what happens in the Big 12 tournament, the 7 probably is their floor. They probably would have to lose out to go lower than that, but it's not impossible.
I guess the reason I'm fascinated by both of those teams is, and we're used to seeing this at Michigan State, especially in the last few years, where MSU has very frequently been operating in this 7, 8, 9 range in terms of seed. And you know, because of what Michigan State's history is in the tournament, that those 1 seeds or 2 seeds that are set to play them in the second round are absolutely terrified. Whether they should be or not is another question. Sometimes it's borne out that way, sometimes it hasn't. But I would think the dynamic, if you've got a Gonzaga or a Kansas playing a 1 seed or a 2 seed in a second round game, that's not one that top seeded team is looking forward to. And regardless of the struggles those two teams have had this year, they're still Gonzaga, they're still Kansas, and that carries some psychological weight, I think, if nothing else. So that's why I was really interested where if you thought they could get that low to where they might be playing in a game like that. The last blue blood I wanted to talk about, you mentioned them briefly when you were talking about your first 4 out, is North Carolina. Is there a reasonable path for Carolina to get into the field, in your opinion?
See, now North Carolina's path into the field is going to come down to how much the committee cares about the ACC tournament and if they can make a run in the ACC tournament if they don't beat Duke in this last regular season game. Given how bad the bubble is right now, if they just beat Duke and don't lose to Virginia Tech, if they win their last 2 regular season games, that might just be enough to put them in as long as they don't suffer a bad loss in the ACC tournament. A win over Duke can go that really long way in such a horrific bubble this year. But if they say this week beat Virginia Tech but lose to Duke, as we probably would expect, they're going to need to A, make a run in the ACC tournament, and B, hope the committee cares. Now, historically, a lot of times those late runs in conference tournaments have seemingly been enough to move a team to the right side of the bubble, and then suddenly, oh, they're still out. I mean, look at Texas A&M a couple of years ago.
Right,
So
right.
I would say probably not if they don't beat Duke, except for the fact that they are North Carolina and the committee is inconsistent. Could I see the year the committee finally cares about a conference tournament run just happen to be the year North Carolina goes on that run? That would be quite the coincidence. But for some reason, my gut says maybe they care about a conference tournament run for once if North Carolina is the one to do it.
Well, this a lot of this process is not very clear, and one thing that you need to make sure your house you got clear windows. Make sure you contact the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. Those guys can clean your windows. They can clean your house as well. You get 15% off. You mentioned Final Four when you get your estimate. You can find that at our support page. The Final Four is on theschedule.com/support. So head on over. You won't regret having them take care of your business or your home or whatever it might be. So it's not clear sometimes to me how they pick how you pick the teams that are going to now I've lost my train of thought. I was so big of my clever read. I guess
Good
the question, yeah, it could have been really good, but it turned out not so good. So when it comes to comes to teams getting into the tournament in the last couple weeks, what is it, or actually, when it comes to you guys getting graded, that's what I'm thinking. When it comes to bracket matrix, what is it that it's graded most? Like getting the seeds right, getting the teams right. How does it work? You're number 3. You're not number 1. You were number 1 for after you got the bump from us the first time. And then you went from 2 to 1.
Exactly. Yeah.
Uh,
Hey, good luck,
so you're
Charlie.
still top 5, right? So my question was, what is it that is seated that is most important waiting for the bracketologist? Like, for instance, Lenardi's not very good. He's like in the bottom 20th percentile. Jerry Palm's like bottom 5th percentile or something like that. What is it that separates you guys that's most important? I mean, obviously being right more frequently, right? It's like a 5-year track record or something, but what else goes into it?
Yeah, I think each team it is graded like on one. I'd have to look. I've looked at it before. I think each team you can get 1, 2, or 3 points on. For example, if you picked a team in the field, but you had their seed off by 2 or more seed lines, you just
Oh,
get
okay.
1 point with that team. If you picked a team in the field and you were within 1 of their seed, like you had them in, they were in, but your seed was off by 1, you'd get 2 points with that team. And then if you picked a team in the field and you nailed their seed exactly right, you get 3 points with that team. So pretty much every team that makes it, you can get up to 3 points with
I
them.
see.
1 for having them, 2 for being close with the seed, and 3 for being spot on with the seed. And I think I nailed it. I think that's exactly how they do it. I might have been like slightly off with something, but I'm pretty. It's called a Paymon score if anyone wants to look it up. And
Okay.
that's I think I nailed with how they graded. If not, I'm close.
That sounds right. So then, and going back to the field now, I just had a question about the play-in games. There are obviously 11 seeds that play for two spots. Is it possible that there could be 3 Big Ten teams in those spots where they actually are playing each other, or is that not like, is it not even possible for that to work out that way this year?
No, that is actually completely possible. I mean, if they truly think that 3 Big Ten teams are 3 of the last 4 in, then there would be a Big Ten game in a play-in game. Now, if there were 2, then they would definitely separate them.
Right, right,
There, no matter what, they would each be in one separate. But if 3 of them are in, then and 2 of them have to play each other, they would play each other. They wouldn't arbitrarily bump one of them out and put someone else in a play-in game just to avoid a Big Ten game if they truly thought 3 of the Big Ten game teams were the last 4 in. Now, they say that. Maybe will they just like kind of vote up one of those 3 teams by happenstance to avoid it and say, oh no, they weren't one of the last 4 teams in. I mean, they're humans in there, so
yeah,
I'm
yeah, sure,
not sure they wouldn't bump a team up and say they didn't, but by their rules and bylaws, they say if they were 3 of the last 4 in, they would play each other. I just have a gut feeling they would find a way to make that not be the case, even though it it
right,
technically could be.
totally get it.
And it just seems like with conference expansion and realignment, we've crossed the Rubicon with that stuff. Like
Yeah.
when you've got whatever it is they're saying, 14 SEC teams, 13, whatever the number is, getting into the field. You're
The whole
looking at
SEC almost.
Yeah.
right. You're looking at possibly 11 from the Big Ten if all 3 of those bubble teams get in. I mean, it's inevitable. I know they kind of gave up the ghost several years ago with that whole conference teams don't meet each other any earlier than the Sweet 16 thing. Because I remember we in Michigan State's last trip to the Final Four in 2019, they played Minnesota in a second round game.
Right.
But now we're getting to the point where you just have to completely retire that stuff because the math doesn't add up otherwise. When you got that many teams from 2 conferences, that's like a third of the field just
Exactly.
between the
And
Big Ten and SEC.
they'll still try to avoid it in the first round, but they'd have
Sure.
to keep laxing those. And now the way they would try to do it for the second round is like you said, Michigan State playing Minnesota. I'm pretty sure that year they only played Minnesota once in the regular
Right.
season, and
Right.
that's kind
Exactly.
of their way of doing it now. Is like, all right, you can't have a rematch in the first round, but you can have a rematch in the second round as long as you didn't play that team
Single
twice.
play.
And
Yeah.
then once you get to the Sweet 16, it's just pretty much throw everything out the window except for some added securities for the top 4 seeds kind of being separated by conference.
Right. And that what you just mentioned is actually pretty easy to do now in the Big Ten, at
They
least,
are the penny
because
one.
Yeah.
you've only got 3 double plays. So
Exactly.
the other
Exactly.
14 teams it's single plays. So most of them are going to fit that criteria.
Yeah, it used to be a lot harder when building the bracket because most of you played most teams 2 times. So it's like, ooh, is there
Right.
anyone they played once I could fit them in with? Now it's just like
Right.
I just make sure that's not one of the 3 teams they played twice, and they're good to play there.
Interesting.
All right, Rod, do you have anything else? I think we got through all
No,
the questions on YouTube as well.
I think I'm good.
All right. Well, Dom, once again, thanks so much for joining the show. We really appreciate it. And so until next time, the Final Four is not on the schedule. Go green.
Go green.
All right. It is, of course, much longer for me to stop this on YouTube. So those of you who are live actually get an extra few minutes, moments of us find out all the stuff that goes